Good morning. Welcome to Primetime at Bethel University Library. Primetime is a collaborative program between the Friends of the Bethel University Library, Academic Affairs, and other offices on campus that brings you programming that celebrates learning in and beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. We're so glad that you've joined us today. Join us on Thursday, March 10th, as Dr. Susan Brooks, Professor of English, shares about her recent research in a presentation titled Shifts Happen, Negotiating White Evangelical Backgrounds While Building Identities as Anti-Racist Teachers. Today we welcome Dr. Jeannine Brown, Director of Online Programs for Bethel Seminary and a New Testament scholar, as she shares about her experience writing a commentary on the book of Philippians, which has been just published as part of the Tyndale New Testament Commentary series. I've had the privilege of knowing Jeannine since the days when we were both students at Bethel Seminary. Following her graduation from seminary, she got her PhD at Luther Seminary and has been teaching at Bethel Seminary for over 20 years. Jeannine has authored and co-authored numerous books and articles. She is also a member of the NIV translation team and part of the revision project for the NIV Study Bible. I also had the pleasure to work with Jeannine's daughter, Libby, when she was a student worker at the seminary library. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeannine Brown.
Thanks, Sandy. I want to show you, over 40 years ago, I went to an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship training camp to teach Philippians, or to lead a small group Bible study on Philippians, my sophomore year. And they gave me this commentary by Ralph Martin in the Tyndale series on Philippians. This was my first commentary ever. I don't think I knew what commentaries were at that point. And so when I was asked to consider writing this commentary, it is the same series, it looks a little bit different, but I was aware how rich that was, how ironic in some ways, how wonderful. So I wanted to share with you a bit about the process and the product of this study of Philippians that I engaged. I've entitled it Nothing New Under the Sun because I wanted to first chat with you about the idea of another commentary, generally speaking, and then for me, a commentary on Philippians. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the project itself and the process. First, why another commentary, generally speaking? This is a debate in our guild. Why keep on proliferating commentaries? I think Juan can tell us about that. And it's a good question. I wonder it myself, and I think about it when I'm asked to do a commentary project. One reason it continues to happen is because there's ongoing scholarship of a biblical interpretation. Archaeological evidence and other kinds of historical finds that help us to think about the presence of imperial temples or the imperial cult at temples in Philippi at the time of Paul's writing, which makes a difference for how we understand that theme of Rome and Paul and Philippians and the Philippian church there in a Roman colony. Commentaries also offer something fairly unique in the sense that they bring together historical study, literary analysis, and theological engagement, the theology of the author, here Paul and Philippians, and they do so in a way that forces the commentator to move toward coherence. How do we bring those together coherently and in kind of a one-picture glance at Philippians? And every commentator does that differently. Now, there's a lot of overlap in the Philippians commentaries. I can verify that. I was just in them for a long time. And yet there are some places, there are decisions I needed to make that really had me wrestle with that idea of coherence between the literary, the historical, and the theological. And to tell you the truth, one really important determination for me in this project was the accessibility of Bible study tools for those who will be reading this commentary series. Because it's meant for lay people, for pastors. I found myself drawn to those kinds of projects, even though I've done and will be doing some commentary writing at a more scholarly level, you might say. Because I really valued this commentary. This little commentary helped me a lot to figure out more about Philippians in that triangle of history, literary, and theological. But what about Philippians specifically? If you can look a few of the books that they pulled that are up here, that I show here as well. I've written on Matthew and the Gospels. This is where I've done most of my work. I've written a book on hermeneutics. I've done some journal articles on 1 Peter, so I'm not unfamiliar in terms of the publishing process with letters, New Testament epistles, but why Philippians? So I want to tell you what drew me to this project. In fact, I was asked to do another letter of Paul for this series, and I said, how about this one? How about Philippians? So I actually injected my own choice into the process. That doesn't always work, but in this case it did. I'm grateful for that. So what drew me to Philippians? Well, my time with InterVarsity and this free commentary I got and the year-long study on Philippians that I co-led with Laurel Bissett in the dorms at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. And this commentary that I received, written by Ralph Martin, which will not be replaced by mine. This is a revised edition of the commentary, but they're not meant to replace, they're meant to continue and augment the original authors and series. I also have taught Philippians, that's the title of Philippians in Greek, in my upper level Greek class. So I had waded into the secondary literature. I had worked through the text in Greek, so it felt like a good choice in that regard. But quite frankly, a lot of it was I love the themes of Philippians. It's Paul's non-cranky letter, if we want to call it that. So joy, the relational warmth, the unity. Yes, there are some issues going on, but they're not dire. It's not a case study in we're at the end of the church. It's a warm, engaged letter, and I was really struck by that through this process of writing the commentary. The Tyndale series format is kind of given to you. I had 10 sections. That was my choice, how many sections to divide the text into. It was based on my outline, which I'll show you in a minute, which nobody's that interested in. But anyway, the 3 parts that I wrote for each of those 10 sections after the introduction to the commentary, context, comment, and theology. The context section was about 500 words setting up the context, both in terms of literary context, where are we in the letter on any particular point. If I'm writing on 127 through 2:4, I have to place that section, but also the context of scholarly engagement. What are the issues scholars are raising? In this series, the idea wasn't to pepper the commentary section with tons of footnotes and outside engagement, although I can't help but do some of that. But the context section is to help kind of name some of the issues, such as 127 through 2:4, the idea of how we understand Rome's place in Philippi, and the interesting language that Paul chooses, and I do think it's deliberate, in 127, polituomai, to have singular allegiance to Christ and not to the state. That's kind of how I read that. So I raised some of those issues in that context section. The commentary is the 4,000-word commentary proper, what you'd expect, verse-by-verse analysis. And then the theology section is meant to be 500 words on the other end to talk about Paul's theological messages. And this was a hard part for me to keep quite to 500 words. Usually it's 600, 700, or 800 words. You'll hear one of the surprises for me was how much I loved these sections. So the outline of the letter, the 10 sections I wrote on, are listed on the slides. And really, it's not a novel outline of Philippians, but it does highlight, with many other commentators, the movement when you start the body of the letter at 127 between exhortation and exemplar. Exhortation, exemplar, kind of this general movement back and forth. And Paul puts forward the exemplar of Christ first in what I call Christ poem, and then Epaphroditus and Timothy, not in that order, and then Paul himself in chapter 3. So it has that kind of back and forth sense to it. So I want to share challenges, surprises, and then themes, not themes of Philippians, but themes of my commentary on Philippians. And I would like to do just a little bit of reading from the text, not too much, because you don't want to have a commentary read to you. But there are some parts that I think will illuminate what you'd get if you picked up the volume and read it, whether in the library or online, or we will have it in the library in the Tyndale series, which we have fully online, so very accessible. First, a challenge of the secondary literature. I've been in the Gospels for a long time. That feels very comfortable. Matthew and Gospels literature, generally speaking. I've certainly taught on Paul in my all my New Testament survey, New Testament explorations courses that we have at the seminary. But just wading in further to what scholars are saying about Philippians. So other commentaries certainly, but monographs, whole books on single topics like the Christ hymn or the Christ poem of chapter 2. There's numbers of monographs on that topic. But also journal articles where you get some of the most recent thinking about Philippians. So all of that, but then you have this other layer because now you're in Paul. And again, I've worked around the Pauline literature broadly, from N.T. Wright to Doug Campbell to, you could name Nijay Gupta, all sorts of people. How deep to wade in into some of the big debates in Paul. Because Philippians is one of the uncontested letters of Paul, the 7 that all scholars say, virtually all I should say, are Pauline. And so I needed to account for Paul, or how did I need to account for Paul? That was a question that got raised, and I'll talk about that as a challenge. Next, which is interpreting Paul in relation to Paul's other letters. How much does it matter to bring in Galatians or Romans or Philemon? Galatians and Romans are those 2 huge books that since the Reformation have shone their light on Paul. And people who think about Paul think about the Paul of those letters, at least in Protestant Western scholarship. And I heard it throughout my study, and I wrestled with how much does that portrait of Paul, or what Marcus Bachmuel calls the icon of Paul from those letters, show up in Philippians? How much should it impact my interpretation? That was an important question, but just from the basic language level, how Paul uses terms and ideas, but also in terms of the tone of the letter. Again, I think this is one of Paul's non-cranky letters, but if you read Galatians a lot, you might tend to read Paul a little more cranky in Philippians, or really pressing at something really strongly. And there are people who interpret Philippians that way, as some major contestation between Paul and the Philippians. So wrestling with it, I was really helped by the hermeneutical category of the implied author. The Paul we know from Philippians, or as Bachmuel would say, the icon of Paul from Philippians. Now, it's not the only thing I wanted to look at for interpretation, but I did want to have that be my primary place to go to think about who is this Paul that emerges. And of course, my goal wasn't to sketch Paul, but to sketch the messages of the letter he wrote to the Philippians. But Paul is as crucial to understanding what Paul's up to, or thinking from the text. Not behind the text as much, but from the text was a goal. So that was tricky, to say the least, for me. A few surprises. First, I had to acclimate to commenting on a New Testament letter, not a narrative. A commentary is always selective. A commentator is always selective on what they choose to address and what they have to let go. Even if you write a 2-volume commentary on Philippians, which someone has done, 4 chapters, 2 volumes, they still are selective. There's no way around it. And I found it actually fairly easy in the Gospel of Matthew, 28 chapters, to make decisions. It was obvious to me that I had to, but also my narrative approach, what's going to inform for my reader the story, helped me to just not pay attention to all sorts of individual words, but scenes and context. And sometimes I looked at individual words quite closely, but it was always driven by the narrative impulse. And that included the kinds of historical information I would bring in and the kinds of theological messages of Matthew I'd engage. All of that was kind of brought through my narrative lens. I got to Paul, and started to plod along through chapter 1 when I got to the commentary right, and I thought, what am I doing? I'm not addressing every single word here. I can't do that. That's just, like a word study approach. I felt like I had returned to my early days of what I thought biblical studies was all about, which was a word study approach. And I was horrified. Somewhere in chapter 1, I went, I can't do this. I've got to figure out what it is that helps me determine if I address a particular word and why, and how that fits within the larger rhetoric of that section. So that was a surprise that it was that hard to start writing, but I've written a few commentaries. The other surprise was I loved the theology sections. Now, this isn't exactly a surprise to me. I love writing on theological engagement, the biblical authors, and how they do theology, how they theologize. So how Matthew theologizes, how John is theologizing, what they're doing with the gospel, the good news of the life, death, resurrection of the Messiah, and how they engage that for theological purposes, Christological, discipleship, all sorts of things. But I really enjoyed these sections, and I had a hard time keeping them to 500 words. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I thought through what I want to engage in each case. Because you have a lot of choices when you move to theological engagement. And I found myself thinking through which choice in each of these 10 sections I would take. So, first of all, you could do this. You can address the theology of Philippians itself. In other words, there are some themes that are very potent just in Philippians, and you can stop there essentially with maybe a little glance at other Pauline letters. I mean, you can think of the theme of joy, and if you're going to write on the theme of joy in any of the Pauline letters, probably Philippians. That isn't one of my 10 topics, by the way, although I reference it in relationship to other themes and theological topics. But for me, and I do this in chapter 4, 2 through 9, that section, and particularly the part in Matthew, there I go. Oh, I knew I was going to do that. Philippians 4, 8 through 9, where Paul says, whatever is good, lovely, pure, excellent, arete, consider these things, evaluate these things, ponder these things. I talk about the theological engagement in culture that I think Paul puts forward in Philippians at a number of points, and I draw some of that together in this part of the letter in my theological section on 4, 2 through 9, to really think about how Paul is pressing the Philippians to be distinct in their allegiance solely to Christ, to the Messiah, and yet to engage culture in some fairly deep ways. That was my theological engagement in one section. It was really pretty much limited to Philippians. And then there are plenty of places you can think about what Paul is doing in a section of Philippians and engage Pauline theology more broadly. And I'll, at the end of the time, read a little bit of my theology section from chapter 1, and the topic of knowledge, how Paul engages knowledge and love in 1, 9 through 11, and how that maps onto some other places Paul talks about those things. You can also look at the history of interpretation and say, I'm going to follow chapter 2, 5 through 11, again, the Christ hymn or poem, and how it's been interpreted, it's been a huge source of theological fodder, if we can put it that way, for the church, for Christology. Marcus Bachmuel in his work does some great looking at the history of interpretation of any particular text in Philippians. I did not do that for any of my 10 sections. I did not feel that was my strongest area, though I'm pressing into that in a current article I'm writing on the Gentile women in Matthew and how they've been interpreted across the centuries. So trying to press myself to grow in that area. Finally, constructive theological reflections, taking a contemporary kind of issue or question and bringing it back to bear on Philippians and hearing the intersection of ideas, seeing what Paul might say to this. I know that's kind of a feigned way of putting it since he's not going to speak to a particularly kind of contemporary issue, but how might these come together in our thinking? I do this in a couple places, chapters 2 and 3. I think about Paul and his Jewishness, because in Western, very Gentile-oriented scholarship, we've tended to misread Jewish cues in the text. So I take that on at a few points. And then I talk about anxiety. And I use some psychological resources. And this is actually in chapter 2 and not in chapter 4, where you might think it would show up. Because I hear a lot of lovely relational anxiety floating around chapter 2, 19 through 30, when Timothy and Paul and Epaphroditus and the Philippians and Paul have this triangle of concern for one another. So I talk a little bit about that in that section. So some themes in the commentary that you would hear. One is the theme of hermeneutics. I really enjoy paying attention to what it is I'm doing and helping people see what it is I'm doing hermeneutically. I just think that's fair to put out there, here's my hermeneutical perspective. Now, in a commentary, you typically don't have a section on hermeneutics at the front. I couldn't help but write one because that's kind of me. But I do think it's important because if you look at 3 commentaries on Philippians, you will hear a bit of a different hermeneutical method for each. Not in its big contours, history, theology, literary shape, but on the micro level and on the choices made and on the assumptions behind various statements. So I'm sure I didn't make all of my hermeneutical vantage point, my interpretive vantage point clear, but I tried to do some of that at the beginning. And so in the introduction of the commentary, I have a section called Hermeneutical Considerations, where I talk about things like how do we read the Philippians in their situation, how do we do historical reconstruction. We all do it maybe slightly differently, and so I tried to kind of say what I'm doing there, and how much Acts shows up, for example, in a Philippians commentary, Acts 16, where Luke tells us about the founding of the Philippian church. Paul doesn't. So, how do we engage that? I talk a little bit about Paul and his language, Paul and his theology, where I sketch out these 4 ways of thinking about theology. They're not the only ways, but they're the ones that I engaged. My approach to linguistics shows up in the introduction in how Paul uses language. And I'm going to read you just a little bit of that. And it has something to do with my aversion for the word literal. So you're going to hear a little bit of that in here. And it illuminates what I think about language and how words work, if we put it that way. I write, increased attention to linguistics informs the way we understand how words work. As we think of individual words, it is important to realize that most words have more than one sense or meaning. And I give the example in Philippians 3:15 of the word teleos, mature or perfect, and some even argue for another initiated kind of sense, initiated into a mystery religion. The point is, it doesn't mean all of those things. It means one of them, and context helps us, and people disagree on this one. As we recognize, I continue, that most words have more than one sense, we should be cautious about asserting that any particular word has a basic sense, a meaning that underlies all other senses of the word. Instead, a word might have a primary sense in any particular author or corpus, like the Pauline letters. Paul uses certain words primarily this way or maybe that way. It doesn't mean he can't use it a third or fourth way. I say, for example, Paul frequently uses the Greek word sarx, often translated in English flesh, to denote the realm of human captivity to sin. He almost does a technical term with this, as contrasted with the realm of the Spirit inaugurated in the Messiah. Yet Paul can use sarx without any negative connotation, as he does in Philippians 1:22 and 24 for his own physical body. Neither usage is more basic. Both are possible senses, depending on context, and there are more senses of that particular word than I list here. I finish up here. The fallacy that any particular word has a basic meaning lends itself to the assumption that it's important to identify the, quote, literal meaning of a word. Yet if words have multiple senses, not a single basic sense, referring to the literal meaning of a word is confusing at best. Paul calls the Philippian believers adelphoi quite a number of times across the letter. This term refers to siblings, either male siblings, as in brothers, or a generic for siblings of both genders, brothers and sisters. Context determines which reference is in view, and given Paul's audience of both female and male believers, he is clearly addressing both when he refers to the Philippians as adelphoi. I say here, it is inaccurate to claim that brothers is the literal meaning of adelphoi. Instead, in any particular context, adelphoi can mean brothers, example Matthew 4:18, but also the singular adelphos in Philippians 2:25 for Epaphroditus, or siblings, brothers and sisters. So I don't use the word literal in my commentary at all. I think it's easy enough to not do that and use other words to help explain what I mean by that. My favorite example of this when I talk with students about this language is when we can say to somebody quite seriously, it's raining cats and dogs out. Literally. That's a nonsensical statement, right? But you're saying, take me seriously, take me seriously as I use this metaphor. I think we don't often trust metaphor in maybe Western contexts as much, so we have to kind of say it literally. So enough of that, I think, probably. I want to note that I also addressed rhetorical criticism a bit in my commentary, not in the sense of identifying exactly what kind of rhetoric this letter might be. Philippians is debated on that topic, and rhetorical criticism, or rhetoric, by the way, in the Greco-Roman world, a young man, as he reached the end of his education in the Greek world, would take rhetoric as his last kind of training, and think about how to persuade. It's about the art of persuasion, with words, with language, with tone, with all those kinds of things. And one of the helpful pieces I have found with rhetorical criticism is to highlight the three angles of rhetoric that are alluded to, mentioned in the ancient world, but also used in contemporary speech making and other places: ethos, pathos, and logos. Often when we're thinking about a letter, we're thinking of logos, the argument of a letter, and that's very, very important. I found it helpful to also think about how Paul develops ethos, his own ethos with the Philippian church, and then how he taps into pathos, their own feeling and experience of his letter. So in each section of the context part of the letter, I end with just a little paragraph on Paul's rhetorical emphasis in that particular part, and explore how ethos, pathos, and logos might show up in that section. And as you might imagine, the beginning of the letter has a lot of ethos going on as he gets started, but also chapter 3, verses 1 through 11, when he tells his own kind of story of what the Messiah has done to him, what following the Messiah has, how it's made a difference. He moves to ethos quite a bit as well. And then I became very, very interested in the Christ poem of 2:6 through 11. It's a debate whether it's a pre-existent hymn. It's a debate whether it's poetry. Gordon Fee calls it elevated prose. But it makes a difference for how you interpret. And I got very interested in that idea of a genre embedded in another genre, poetry within a letter. Do we switch and kind of nimbly turn to interpret poetry, or do we keep on thinking we're in a letter and treat language the same way? And I think we should actually swivel and turn and think poetically about this section. So that's what I argue in my commentary, so we'll just give you a little bit of how that might look in Philippians 2:6 through 8. This is my translation and scansion or line arrangement of the poem. I did not have to produce my own translation for this commentary, but for this section I felt it important because it was poetry and language is used in a bit of a different way, a little more carefully, I would say, at least in terms of sound and other kinds of features in poetry. So this is Philippians 2:6 and following. This is Christ, who, though being in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Rather, he emptied himself by taking the form of a slave. I hear that as the first stanza. Being made in the likeness of human beings and being found in appearance as a human being, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, all the way to death on a cross. And I write, if the first stanza shows generally and in broad strokes the great distance in status traveled by Christ in his incarnation, the second stanza provides a more granular view of what occurred in Christ's embodiment, from his identification with humanity to his obedient death on a cross, the form of execution used for slaves and criminals. And I go on to write, in this stanza, the poem echoes the creation narrative, Genesis 1:26 specifically, to show that Christ's incarnation, in a sense, enacts the Imago Dei in reverse. As humanity is made in the image of God, so in the incarnation Christ is made in the likeness of human beings, 2:7. As Susan Eastman suggests, by taking on humanity's likeness, Christ, quote, repeats, replicates, and reverses Adam's story, end quote. So again, I hear the first stanza showing the great lengths from being in the form of God, sometimes translated nature of God, that's a whole big debate, and then to the form of a slave, the largest gulf or the largest distance one could travel. And then in the second stanza, hearing how Christ, being made in the likeness of human beings and being found in the appearance of a particular human being, humbled himself and went to the cross. So this reversal or interchange of humanity and Christ's role. Some of the themes that I raise in the theology sections, I just want to list them: knowledge, the gospel, allegiance, Christology. I've talked a little bit about them already. Jewish roots, anxiety, eschatology. Chapter 3 of Philippians particularly focused on eschatology, cultural engagement, and a theology of abundance. particularly from and for communities that have very little. So I want to make that really clear that the end of Philippians has sometimes been used by health, wealth, prosperity gospel folks. Elsa Tamaz in her commentary really helpfully points out that these are people with little or nothing. Paul, when he says, I've learned to be content in all things, is really talking from a place, well, he's in prison. So he's not in a place of great abundance. So thinking about how God as a gift giver, God as the one who provides, functions for people who have very little, not who have very much. So I try to intersect with that in terms of a Western context where I have a lot. So that's kind of how I end that piece. So to conclude, and then we have lots of time for questions because I clearly talked faster than I planned to. I want to end with a couple readings. One is, I think they're both from the theology sections. Yes, I'm going to do this one first. On the section that's on the gospel, 1:12 through 26. I talk about, there's an interesting framing here in 1:12 and 1:25 of the progress or the advancement of the gospel and of the Philippians. It's the language of prokope, and it forms a little bookend, and I kind of ruminate on that here in my theological section. So God's redemption of Paul has ensured that the rest of his life will be spent in continuing gospel ministry. The opportunity to proclaim the good news of redemption through Christ to more people, and the chance to see the Philippians again for their continued progress and joy. 125. This last sentiment shows that Paul's commitment to the gospel is already an abiding commitment to the people God has entrusted to him. The framing of this passage with the language of prokope, advanced progress, highlights Paul's commitment to the development of both the gospel and the Philippian believers. For all Paul's emphasis on the gospel, it must be remembered that the gospel is a story of our relational God enacting salvation for people through Christ, the representative human one. Paul's gospel focus is not devotion to an abstract principle or truth. It is inherently people-focused because the gospel is a story of humanity's redemption. Paul devotes himself to people and to Christ, whose work has made all the difference. And then from the very first section in my sections on theology, where I think about the themes in 1, particularly 9 through 11, of love leading to knowledge, to discernment, to doing and being and understanding what is best. And I think about that in light of Paul's, I think, a little bit of ambivalent relationship with knowledge that we hear in 1 Corinthians and maybe a few other places. So here we go. Paul joins love and knowledge closely together, 1:9, a connection that is all the more intriguing given the sometimes ambiguous relationship between the two, love and knowledge, across the Pauline corpus. At times, Paul can emphasize the tension between knowledge and love, as he does in 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 3, when commenting on the Corinthians' use of knowledge, or gnosis, in ways that harm a weaker brother or sister. He writes, knowledge puffs up while love builds up, 8:2. In his ode to love in that same letter in chapter 13, Paul stresses that knowledge without love is worthless. Even when he is not expressly critiquing a certain kind of or a certain way of pursuing knowledge, Paul routinely prioritizes love over knowledge, 1 Corinthians 8:3. We hear this in Ephesians as well. Christ's love surpasses knowledge, and love is the culminating virtue in 2 Corinthians 8. The argument of Colossians 2:2 runs in a similar fashion to Philippians 1:9. Love leads to understanding and knowledge. As Scott comments on Colossians 2, love is thus the key to achieving right understanding, not just moral understanding, but understanding of Christ. In Philippians 1:9, love, accompanied by knowledge and insight, is the springboard to discerning what is best. So it's instructive to ponder again the direction of Paul's prayer for the Philippians. Love leads to discernment. As Carolyn Oziak notes, we would expect knowledge to lead to love, but Paul puts it the other way around. Love is not something to be added to a list of Christian virtues. It is the starting point from which all good things, the best things as Paul suggests, grow. Love joined by knowledge leads to discerning what is best, which leads to blamelessness and righteousness, doing and being what is best. Discernment and holiness are not possible without love. Now, ranking love under knowledge is an easy path to follow, especially in circles that prioritize right doctrine, orthodoxy. And I think of my experience at Bethel here, and being from that very context that did that and does that. In such contexts, it can be tempting to think that imparting knowledge about the Bible, about faith, will necessarily produce Christian discipleship and right ways of living, orthopraxy. Yet prioritizing knowledge over love can lead to what Paul warns so vigorously against in 1 Corinthians, a puffed up kind of knowledge that lacks a building up kind of love. Prioritizing knowledge over love can lead to warped views of both, as when knowledge is viewed as a means of tempering the too wide embrace of love by pursuing a more discriminating love. What Paul seems to offer in his vision for the Philippians is an inclusive and ever-growing love that leads to discernment. We might call it a discerning love. Discerning love, I would suggest, seeks to discern how to love well rather than how far it should extend and where it should stop. Discerning love is thoughtful, but it is not stingy. I am happy to take your questions. Thanks for listening. Abrupt ending, as it were. We've got lots of time for questions, like 15 minutes if you want. Comments, questions, thoughts?
Start off with a question from online.
Sure.
Billy Hinshaw asks, how would you respond to scholars who argue that Philippians is a compilation of separate letters Paul wrote to the church in Philippi?
And do you want me to repeat the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, how do I respond to scholars who say the Philippians is a compilation of letters, 3 different letters, possibly? Ruman in his commentary argues for this. Particularly because there are some abrupt junctures. That's one reason. There's an abrupt juncture between 3:1 to 2 in that area. So the integrity of the letter, or the written from beginning to end, has been argued against by some because of that. And also the ending of the letter, 4:10 through 20. I mean, if this is really a thank you letter of Paul to the Philippians for their gift, which it seems to be, that's really an important reason for the writing of the letter, then why in the world is it at the end? Was that originally the letter, and then other letters were sent after that part, like chapter 3 by itself, and the rest of it kind of strung together? The first thing I would say is the tendency and the trend is to see the letter more holistically. That's kind of the general trend of Philippians scholars. And part of that comes from a recognition of oral as well as written facets of the text. The oral as in people heard it read out versus read it on paper. So for example, Paul Achmeyer argues that abrupt shift in chapter 3 makes more sense in an oral context where we use the language of ta loipon, which could be finally, but it could also, it's a way to say change in direction, folks, in a more of an oral context. That's a very short summary of his very long article on that. But that there is a sense where the oral calls for more kind of wake-up moments to show a shift in direction. And Gordon Fee argues that the end of the letter, that thank you note that comes in 10 through 20, that Paul may have wanted that to be kind of ringing in their ears at the end. In other words, you can put it up front to make a big impact, and you can also put it at the end, whether I think in an oral or a written context, but certainly in an oral context, they would have had that in their kind of ringing in their ears as they left the reading of the text, especially since the whole thing ends at 4:23. You just have like 3 brief verses of conclusion, and then you're done. And you have that kind of in your memory, this Paul thanked us, or something like that. So that's what I would say. I saw a hand up in the back.
Yes, did you find any particular commentary just totally captivating as you were reading these? Like you kept coming back to it and found it to be inspired and hard to get away from?
That's a great question. Juan asked if I found one particular commentary to be particularly captivating. I kept on coming back to. I loved the writing of Dean Fleming in the Wesleyan Beacon commentary series. I don't even know if I knew this series very well prior to engaging this, and I happened to pick it up somewhere. Dean Fleming, he's a great writer. If I wanted to know if I wanted to hear that sort of turn of phrase, good insights, and also be inspired sort of language-wise, because I felt like in writing my commentary, I wanted to think closely about how I use language. And that's just sort of a value I've come to my writing more and more as I get old. I want to say it in ways that have impact. The rhetorical piece, I guess I'm studying Paul's rhetoric. I wanted to be thinking about my own rhetoric. So Dean Fleming did that really nicely. Elsa Tam, as I came to later in the Process Wisdom commentary series, I don't know why I didn't know of her work sooner. I got really frustrated at sometimes the way some people's voices had been tucked back in the way other people are referring to them, right? And her work on Paul's imprisonment, I mean, she takes some of the scholarly work, monographs on prison in the ancient world, but she brings it really helpfully into how would this have felt and looked and been. I loved that. For the poetry piece, I mean, I was hearing kind of the direction of the argument of the Christ poem or Christ hymn as a movement away from seeing this as highly poetic. I think Silva's commentary is great. Gordon Fee I love. But Fee doesn't think it's particularly poetic. It's elevated prose. Silva and Bachmiel both paid attention to the poetry more. But I went back to Jeremias and his little article in German, so I had to slog through that bugger. And see his, I just found that's really good work. So often we think we can improve upon all these folks from before, and I found myself really getting excited about engaging that early work because I just felt like he nailed so much of it. So that's a peppered answer to your question. Now, if you want to read somebody who pays attention to text critical issues, Silva, because I'm looking at some text critics out here. But I was very interested in that question because I was presenting at a Society of Biblical Literature text critical section on how I do that kind of work or how I bring it into my commentary writing. So I was very keenly aware that I had just talked about this and there are people holding me accountable in some sense to this. So I think I addressed 9 text critical issues in the commentary itself. And Silva was great on that, Bachmiel, Fee, of course. So
I have 2 questions. One is about the process, and I'll wait till later for that. But on the translation, I don't think you said, did you write your own translation, or were you required to use a particular?
Yes, I had the choice of the NIV or the NRSV. I started to do my own translation because I forget to read the specs sometimes when I'm coming back to a project after saying this. And I did realize in my Matthew commentary that I had to do a translation. That was a little bit horrifying at one point along the way. But I did it. It was great. I don't know if it's great, but it ended up being really helpful for me. But I started to do it, and then I realized, I don't have to do that. The series uses either of those translations you can choose. And I'm on the NIV translation team, so it made sense to use the NIV. That doesn't mean I always agree with everything there. And so when I do disagree with the translation that I'm using, there's no translation put in the text. In other words, people have it next to them as they're reading. It's not listed in the text. I would try to be, I'm always trying to be really careful with translations. I don't usually say that translation is wrong. You can get the feeling from that, from my discussion, but here's the reason for the NIV. I would sometimes include that and say, and then I would use another translation that I felt got it better. So that's how because I just think we're so good at denigrating translations. Why not instead use them in ways that are more positively focused? To say, yeah, we all get it wrong sometimes on a particular translation. And another translation gets other things right and other things wrong. So I use the NIV, but there are points where I went with a different reading. And then I just try to be very thoughtful about how I shared that. I also want to be aware that when I'm teaching in almost every context I'm in, most people don't have Greek or Hebrew. And if I pull the English text that they're used to reading and find confidence in reading away from them by saying, no, but in the Greek it says, then I'm really undercutting what they read. That doesn't seem fair. Instead to say, oh, read a couple different translations, see where there are some points of significant disagreement, then go to the commentaries, right? Or the places where you can help hear that kind of ameliorated or mitigated.
Should I follow up with my process question?
Sure.
Or I don't
No,
want to.
I don't think there's any particular order.
So when you wrote this commentary, and you have a lot of experience in this, so you probably went at it already with confidence. How long did it take you, and how focused was the time that you invested? Like, did you quit everything else in your life and just do it, or did you keep working on it over a long period of time?
Grandbabies were born during the writing of the commentary, so no, I did not drop everything at all. There's no possible way that could happen. So the process question of how did I drop everything? How did I address that? I find myself ramping up for a commentary project by getting at the secondary literature. I mean, reading the text over and over again, and then getting a sense of the secondary literature. I had the good fortune of being asked to do a couple of articles for the revised Dictionary of Paul and His Letters that'll be coming out in 2023. I did the one on Philippians. They asked me to do Philippians. They must have known I was doing this project. So that was very nice, and some of that material shows up in my introduction, so I was able to do some of the legwork on history, literary shape, theology, some of that introductory stuff, genre, and actually have something to work from. I did revise some of that. I mean, so if you read Dictionary, Paul and His Letters, Philippians, if you read that another year and you read my introduction closely, nobody has to do that. But I've shifted on a few things or thought more deeply about something or other. And the other one was the Paul and hermeneutics. So I kind of looked at the span of how people interpret Paul, which some of that became helpful as well. So that was nice to actually push to some writing early on. Because I find sometimes if I just study and don't get writing, it kind of stops me up. So, I mean, I had great advice when I was doing my dissertation. When you have 25% of your research done, start writing. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. But I had 25% of my research done, so I thought I'd give it a shot. And I wrote a very holy, like Swiss cheese holy kind of section of one chapter of my dissertation. But then I knew where to study more and fill in holes. So it actually worked pretty well. I think I waited for longer than 25% for this. But I do read as I go and then search deeper depending on an issue and go back and revise. So if getting writing sooner can sometimes be helpful to just kind of unstop my processes.
And that sort of speaks to my last question, which was how do you keep track of everything? Some people's brains just do that, but
Yeah.
if you have any
How to keep track of everything process-wise. Dr. Anderson is writing a commentary.
Try.
I don't have great systems. I mean, obviously I have a Word document, and I have piles of things on my desk. Like I have the poetry pile for Philippians, even now because I'm working on a lecture on that topic that kind of came out of the commentary race. So I have these piles. That makes sense to me, but sometimes I look for something for a half an hour and it drives me nuts that I didn't do a better job of whatever I was supposed to do with that. So I don't think I'm a great person to chat with about that. But I do keep it track. And if I put it in a document, it's always easier to find than if I just leave it on a slip of paper somewhere. So I've learned to put more things in documents. You young people will be like, what? What are slips of paper? I don't know what those are. Nira?
Yeah, so regarding your use of secondary sources, so when it comes to selecting what you read or when you come up in an issue as you're writing, then how do you know when you have covered a broad enough base of secondary literature? How do you feel confident that you've spotted your blind spots?
Yeah.
What's your process?
Yeah, and it's so hard because you could read forever in Philippians and never write anything because there's that much. And there's a 2-volume commentary out there by Mark Keown on Philippians, and and that's not the longest thing out there. So, I think for me, that's a really good question. I think feeling like I'm starting to hear some of the same themes or arguments, it gets me to a point where at least I can start writing. I'm really interested to listen for a fresh voice. And that's where I'll keep on looking And journal articles for, kind of searching the journal databases just to see, am I missing something here? In chapter 3, Paul talks about his kind of pedigree as a Jewish man, tribe of Benjamin, that section on chapter 3, 4 through 6. And then he talks about how it's all rubbish, that whole turn of considering differently now. And I just really wanted to get a good sense of that from a perspective that doesn't toss Judaism out the window. I was really looking for someone to guide me in that section. I started to find a few voices. I came up with, there's a commentary on Philippians, or it's not a commentary, but it's a book on Philippians, Philippians after supersessionism, that I found that ended up being really helpful for me to think about how to not throw out baby in bathwater, because I don't think Paul's doing that, but rhetorically it's a very strong moment. So I had to kind of figure out how to listen to Paul's rhetoric and say, what is he doing and what is he not doing here? So that was like what I looked for a while. And I wasn't happy with chapter 3 until I had a couple other voices. Mark Nanas has written on that topic. He's a Jewish scholar of New Testament literature. So just trying to find the voices that would help me press against my own assumptions that I had grown up with, that I thought about more recently, even, who's talking about this in some ways that help me hear first century Judaism without saying, well, that's a bad thing. We have to get rid of that now in the Messiah. So that was an important point to keep on pressing for more voices. Go ahead.
Tyndale series has been around for a long time. When you were asked to contribute to it, what did you pick up about how the ambitions or aspirations of the series have changed? Because 50 years is a long time.
Yeah.
The composition of the, who's going to be writing and so on is clearly going to be different.
Yeah. So the Tyndale series has been around a long time. How did I pick up on maybe ways the series it's still the same format, it's the context, comment, theology, but it felt to me, and I'm not sure if this is a series goal, but it was the goal, one of my goals, was to really think about the literary shape, the rhetorical shape of the letter, because that feels like it's an important thing to be reckoning with in this moment. I don't think there were, 50 years ago that just wasn't kind of quite on the horizon. And I mean, people knew stuff all about rhetoric, of course, on that. But just kind of the integrity of the letter, kind of hearing it as a whole, doing that as an exercise. And the other piece was the theology sections that I've read, in the first version, are kind of like preaching points, places to preach, kind of themes and how we might preach it. And I just wanted to do something a little richer theologically, constructive theology at some point. So really thinking about just the theology of Philippians. And, in the end, we're not going to just do theology off of Philippians. But, there's something about reining ourselves in to an author and saying, I just want to, not just, peppered with cross-references, even in Paul. So that felt like a place I wanted to contribute.
And how much did you know about the other contributors?
I had an exemplar just to kind of know how this is a UK project, so the specs, the single quotation marks within punctuation, oh my goodness, it's like I can't do anything but at that point I could do it. So part of it was I was just looking for that, but I also paid then attention to what they were addressing in that exemplar. And Doug Moo's commentary on James is already available. So I kind of went to some places to kind of see what more formal kinds of things. I felt like I wanted to go the direction I wanted to go with more of the substance.
Yeah, I guess part of what I'm getting at is that having used that series a lot, it seemed like the standard authors were from the English-speaking world, mostly from the UK, trustworthy, quote-unquote, Bible scholars, and all men. So how much is the roster of authors changed? Is it more diverse than it was then?
And I don't have the whole list of who's writing the revised versions. I still think there's a tendency toward, there is in commentary rating male-dominated Western white. But I found then, I mean, it's like, who are the voices I'm going to, so Lynn Cohick in The Story of God, which is a very popular commentary, but she's an insightful scholar, so how can I kind of bring out the best of what she's doing when she's doing something really maybe newer, deeper, engaging. Elsa Tama's, Bonnie Thurman, and whichever one. So I'm just trying to pay attention to non-white Western male voices, because I will have to pay attention to white male voices. I mean, I love Gordon Fee's commentary on everything, so so I will do that automatically in a sense, because I've been trained by that tradition. So just thinking about how to expand engagement partners.
Thank you.
And I think we are out of time. Thank you so much for your attention. Really appreciate your time today.